What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. Today brings us something very different. It's about 5:45 in the morning. That's a cat, and I'm going to be going into uni for the first time since my course started, for my first ever at uni session, shall we say. So I'll be filming little bits throughout the day, probably about as much as I can get away with, and yeah, we'll go from there. So to make things as easy as possible, I'm going to be using a combination of the camera on my phone and my actual camera, shall we say. So there might be a little bit of a difference in quality between the two cameras. Just step out into the light a little bit more, that's better. But yeah, so it might be noticeable, but it will make it a bit easier than just whacking a camera out every 5 minutes. But yeah, currently waiting for the bus. It's going to take me approximately 2 hours to get to uni, so now just waiting for the metro. It's just a couple of stops away before I get to the uni. I have only just missed a train, but it does mean that everywhere is nice and clear, so I don't feel as self-conscious about doing this. So, just finished my first ever session, actually in the classroom here, which is a bizarre thing to be saying in of itself, given that I almost finished the first term of this course. But it was lovely being able to see everyone, even lovelier that everyone was quite keen to be on camera. Well, I say quite keen to be on camera. They were coerced a little bit. But I did ask permission, very important thing, always ask permission before you're going to actively film someone. Like if you're filming someone's like face, if it's the back of the head, it's a bit dodgy, but it's still not too bad. But if you are going to be filming someone outright, then you really do need to get their permission. Doesn't have to be like written, verbal consent's fine, but yeah. So off to make the 2.5 to 3 hour journey back. Although while I'm here, there certainly are worse places to be doing this. And we are back in the office space again. So, it's been a week since I took the footage that you've just seen. As I've mentioned previously, I'm now going to be doing these videos every 2 weeks so that I can kind of fit more in and make them a little more content heavy, shall we say. So, where do we start from here? Well, I think the best thing for us to do is going to be to talk about what I actually did on the Tuesday. So this was prior to everything that you've just seen where I've gone out into Sunderland. This was actually an individual session that I did here, but I felt that for the purposes of storytelling, the footage of me going into Sunderland was a better way to start than just having it plonked in the middle of all this. So yes, assessment. So we've already covered off quite a bit about assessment on the channel in the previous videos, but we did go into a lot more depth last Tuesday in the session that we had. So we discussed there being 4 cornerstones of assessment, those being power of discrimination, objectivity, validity, and reliability. So power of discrimination, to break it down to its most basic level, is knowing that not everything can be assessed on the same level, lest you get inaccurate results, and in some cases unfair results. I believe it was Einstein who said if you judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, then it will spend its entire life thinking it's stupid. I don't know whether it was actually Einstein who said that, or whether it's one of those motivational quotes that is that's attached to a picture of a famous person in the hopes that it'll catch on. But the message is still valid. Objectivity speaks for itself. The ability to be objective is so important when it comes to looking at people's results, marking people's work, making sure that they're doing what they need to. If you're not objective, then there is no telling whether or not you are giving a fair representation of their abilities, their promise, and their skills, so on and so forth. It ultimately comes down to not letting your own personal prejudices stop you from giving a fair mark. So things can be done to help this, providing things like mark schemes, for instance, that people are to use, rather than just using their own sort of judgment, shall we say. There is a certain amount of judgment that does need to be made, but still the point still stands. Objectivity, incredibly important to make sure that everything is fair across the board. So validity, that's in of itself, thinking about what the word validity means from the stem valid, meaning that it has purpose, it's correct. For a test to have validity, it must actually test what it's supposed to. It's no good having a maths test that is primarily a breakdown of Shakespeare's plays. It's a very far-fetched example that I've given there, but that would be an example of an invalid test. The example that we were given was if someone was brought in and told to do 10 press-ups, and we use that to judge their intelligence. It has very little to do with someone's intelligence whether or not they can do press-ups. That's down to their physical health, not down to their mental ability. So that in of itself becomes an invalid test because it's not testing what it's actually supposed to. Any results that come off of that, they have no value. So moving on from validity, if we look at reliability, reliability is basically making sure that whatever test you're doing consistently produces the same results. Now, of course, it's impossible to repeat a test with different test subjects and have the result be exactly the same every time. And I mean exactly the same. There will be similarities, but you can't do that. You have to factor in for people's individual needs and approaches. So when you're constructing a test, as well as making sure that it's actually testing what it's supposed to, you have to make sure that if the test was repeated, it would garner the same, if not similar, results. So when you're looking at, say, a standardised test, for instance, so we touched on standardised tests last week, you can at least be certain
that because it's the same questions every single time, it will reliably garner a similar kind of result. You're not going to, say, have one paper where someone has ticked all the boxes and then another paper where instead of ticking all the boxes they've written an essay. So you're going to reliably come up with the same results each time. Again, don't know if that was the greatest example in the world, but it was the first one that came to mind, so do excuse me. So, the assessment side of things was what we covered in the in the second half of the session on Tuesday. As this video goes on, I'm going slowly further back in time, but it will make a little more sense. So, the other thing that we looked at was beginning to construct knowledge organisers and schemes of work. So, for want of a better term, a knowledge organiser is like a prompt sheet, almost a cheat sheet to a certain extent. Typically no more than 2 sides of A4, and it will have all of the key terms, all of the key facts, and most of the things that you would need to remember about the topic, the module, whatever it is that you're doing, so that it's easy to refer back to. It's also a good jumping off point for prompting students' memories of what's gone on. Now, of course, their own notes and various other bits of teaching will do that as well, but having that knowledge organiser there also allows them to see that there is a structure to what we're doing, and gives them something to refer back to if they do need that additional help there. The scheme of work is basically an outline for the entire year as to what it is that you're planning to do. So of course typically you would do this prior to the start of the year. A lot of curriculums do actually provide their own scheme of work, as do many institutions. So in most cases teachers will have to adapt whichever they are given to either match their own style, or vice versa, they will have to match their style to the institution and maybe adapt something that they've already done. I myself have been working through the Pearson's BTEC in Creative Media Production. There's actually a very good, well, I say very good, in so much as I'm qualified to comment on it. I've been trying to adapt the scheme of work that they have available on their site into my own, using a slightly different template. Now, I'm not saying that the way that I've done it or the way that they've done it is right or wrong. From the amount of different schemes of work or schemes of learning, depending on which terminology you use, that I've seen, there is so much differentiation. There are a few things that remain the same in terms of structure, but a lot of places seem to have their own way of doing it, and that goes back to what I was saying earlier about needing to adapt to wherever it is that you're working to make sure that the scheme of work that you produce matches the kind of format that they're looking for. The big thing that I'll definitely be taking away from the BTEC scheme of work, or again scheme of learning, depending on what term you want to use, is the idea of having a media consumption diary. So it's established in the first lesson that as homework students will create a media consumption diary. What that is a little diary that they'll keep of every single piece of media that they use, that they come into contact with. So whether it's them watching TV, whether they're accessing YouTube on their phone, whether they're looking at a news article, whether they're playing a video game, whether they're on the bus and someone's got a radio on, so on and so forth. And it's that's going to inform a lot of their learning throughout the course. I noticed that there wasn't a lot of homework set on this particular scheme of work, which I'm quite happy with for the time being. I've already made my feelings known on homework. But just to reiterate, it was never my favourite thing at school. I understand its importance, but it was always the one thing that I got in trouble for, mainly because I didn't do it in most cases. Luckily my outlook has changed to a certain extent, otherwise it would make this course very, very difficult. But yeah, having this one continuous piece of homework where you just keep a note of whenever you're using any kind of media, not only is simple and really easy to produce, but it keeps an awareness of the different media that the students are using in their minds at all times, and informs what they're going to learn actually really well. So I'll give you an example. I believe the second week we start looking at primary and secondary audiences. So primary audience is basically whomever it is, or whichever audience is directly consuming the media product. So that could be me sat watching a video on my mobile phone. The secondary audience would be someone who comes in, sees that I'm watching a video on my phone, and can hear what's going on in the background. I suppose a better example of this would be like when you're a child, you sat in the back of a car and your parents are driving along and your dad puts on the radio, or whichever parent, and you're not really listening to the music per se, but you are still technically consuming that media, but you are doing so as a secondary audience. So by getting them to do this media consumption diary, they're maybe already have that chance to start thinking about, oh, actually this wasn't really me that was listening to this, but you know, I still heard it. And it makes concepts like that a lot easier to grasp than just saying, okay, so this is this and this is this. You're giving them practical experience of what that's actually like, so they have something to relate it back to, which makes it a heck of a lot easier for them to digest. So the media consumption diary, regardless of whether I'm doing, regardless of whether I end up doing this curriculum or not, 100% is something that I intend to take forward, because I can see just it would be so incredibly useful. So moving on to Wednesday and actually being in the classroom itself, as I mentioned earlier on in the video, it was a nice change to be there despite the amount of travel, and to see everyone and to kind of feel like I was actually back at university, back learning again, rather than just kind of taking a course from home. It was a nice change. Now, as regards to what we actually covered, the main thing that I wanted to talk about was an excerpt from a radio program from back in 2008, I believe. This was around the time of the introduction of the A-star grade at both GCSE and A-level. And it's a little piece looking at really the validity of the A-star and what criteria do you really have to hit to be able to achieve a grade like that? Even more so, is it possible? So when you look at marking criteria, in a lot of cases, up to a certain level, you'll have shows some understanding, shows good understanding, shows excellent understanding, and then all of a sudden you start going from excellent to exemplary to complete, and these are all words that to a certain extent can become very interchangeable. It makes it very difficult to assess what exactly is it that someone has to do to achieve this grade. Yes, they have to be able to do everything listed below that, but then it becomes a lot more vague. So the argument for this is that by having this system across the board where everyone has to follow the same marking criteria, it makes it more fair. And to a certain extent that is correct, because as we spoke about with objectivity validity, reliability, power of discrimination and everything earlier, by having all of those things, you ensure that everyone is being marked fairly. But when you put that into practice, what actually happens? So, an exam question regarding Shakespeare's Hamlet was put to the former head of the Royal Shakespeare Company, as well as a gentleman whose name unfortunately escapes me, who has won awards for his interpretations of Shakespeare, Hamlet, so on and so forth. So these were two professionals who knew the play inside and out, and who would be considered experts in their field of doing that. They were given the same exam conditions as any student would get, so they were given an hour in silence and isolation to write an answer to the question that they were given. The question they were given was something along the lines of: Hamlet's actions are more to protect his mother than his father. How much do you agree with this statement? I have a problem with the question in of itself, because it does suggest that there is no alternative opinion on that. And at the end of the day, a lot of what we talk about with literature, with media and so on and so forth is down to opinion and interpretation. There are things that are solid facts, like what is a verb, what is an adjective, but the rest comes down to the interpretation of what did the author mean, without being able to actually ask them. And even if you do ask them and they say, no, it means this, people will still have their own interpretations of what has happened. So that in of itself makes it even more difficult. But the problem with the question itself is the lack of context that the two of them had. So they both started writing away, and after an hour submitted their answers. An independent grader for the exam. The exam board took the papers in, marked them using the mark scheme with no prior knowledge of who it was that they were actually marking, and then presented their grades back to them. Neither of them got higher than a B, which does seem to suggest that there is a little bit of an issue, because if someone who is an expert in their field cannot get more than a B grade in an exam that is designed for people who have maybe studied that field for less than a year, there's potentially an issue there. Now, looking at what those issues actually are, it was recognised that they didn't know what it was that they were supposed to be doing with the question. As it turns out, the examiners actually wanted you to question whether that statement was correct, and expected that the statement would be quoted within the essay itself. The problem you have when having a set marking criteria is that it leaves very little room for innovation and creativity. Effectively, students have to match everything that's on there in order to get the marks, and as we were speaking about with standardised testing, what that leads to is students learning how to complete a test and not how to apply that knowledge to their future lives. So yes, fantastic, people might well be getting A's and A stars, but in the vast majority of cases that is because they know that in order to get those A's and A stars, they know exactly what criteria they have to hit and don't stray from it. This means that someone who comes up with a completely innovative and brilliant idea may be marked down for it because it's not on the mark scheme. Now, obviously this isn't the case in every single example that you can think of, But that's where the danger lies in having that kind of a system, which I thought was very interesting. Particularly given that when that same system is used to test experts, they don't do much better than a B. So moving on from that, on the following Tuesday we were back once again at the desk, and we were starting to look at applying grading and the way that we think about grading. We were given a starter activity where we were asked to first of all come up with what we believe would be on grading criteria for if someone were to draw a triceratops. So for myself, 3 horns because it's a triceratops, 4 legs, scales, 2 eyes. Very, very basic stuff. We were then shown a picture, an artist's representation, shall we say, of a triceratops and asked to draw our own. So we may not actually be able to see it on screen here, but I'm gonna hold it up regardless in the hope that you can sort of see the drawing that I did there. I am no artist, so it's not particularly good. But the point of this wasn't to draw a really good picture, it was to make sure that we understood the way that things were marked. We were then given the actual mark scheme and asked to score ourselves based on what we could read with that. I mean, I scored myself relatively high. It looked a lot like the picture that we were shown, and the dimensions were all there. There was a bit of detailing, so I was quite happy with that. To move on from that, we were put into pairs. I'm not going to name names because I haven't actually asked them if I can yet. But the colleague that I was paired with was previously, well, I say was previously, it didn't stop being, but was an art student, so naturally very, very hard on themselves when it came to looking at grading their picture, which was a million times better than mine in the same amount of time that we had. I mean, we only had 5 minutes. So it was interesting. I know that with a lot of people, they're often a lot harder on themselves than maybe other people would be. What it taught me was a little bit of skill development, shall we say, in getting people to recognise when actually they have done what they're supposed to, and they have done well. What we were asked to do off the back of this was to write a little bit of feedback in what is being coined as a praise burger. There is another term for it, but I would like to try and avoid swearing on here if I can. So, basic concept of a praise burger. So you've got your bun, that's a bit of praise. You've got the burger, that's a little bit of negativity or a negative point or weakness, and then you've got your other bun, which is another bit of praise. So it's effectively, it's like softening the blow so that students don't get fixated on the negative aspects, because it does happen. So what did I write then? So I put, you've hit all of the main markers for what we would expect to see. Given more time, I believe a higher level of detail could be achieved. It may be advantageous to do a smaller drawing to be able to fit more in. This is really promising. So the basic structure is there. Now I'm aware that the bit of constructive criticism in the middle does need work, because all I'm doing there is saying, oh, you should do this. In a lot of research, it's encouraged that instead of just saying what it is that someone should do, you should ask questions that will lead them to that answer themselves, because in that way, because they've had to figure it out themselves, it embeds a little more clearly. But as I say, the basic structure is there. So praise, constructive criticism, praise. Easy stuff. So once we've moved beyond the praise burger. We then made a return to our old friend Dylan William, who I spoke a little bit about on the last video. Now you may have noticed that in that last video when I was talking about Dylan William, it was all relatively positive things that we had to say. In this session we looked at someone who wasn't necessarily categorically disagreeing with everything that Dylan William was saying, but did construct an argument against it. So this was from an article, and I'm just referring back to what I can see on my screen here. This is referring to an article from the Times Educational Supplement, or TES for short, by David Didau. I am probably getting his name wrong, so apologies David Didau or Didau or however that name is said, sorry. So we were asked to have a read through the article and to see to what extent we agreed with his counter arguments. So his main point seems to be that in practice not all of Dylan Williams' theories always work. I suppose it's worth noting that following the classroom experiment, once Dylan William was no longer there to oversee it, the school did integrate his methods throughout the entirety of it, but within a year or two had gone back to exactly where they were because it just wasn't working for them. So interesting to bear in mind, because whilst it's initially successful, it doesn't necessarily mean success is guaranteed going forward. For me, I don't believe that Didau in his short piece was necessarily disagreeing with absolutely everything that William was saying. He was just merely pointing out there were areas for clarification and adjustment, which is clear from the fact that, you know, not absolutely everything had worked. I kind of have a byword, like Dylan William has become a byword for me for whenever I see someone saying I don't want to do this because X and Y, and then someone just says okay, but just do it anyway. Because it really feels like a lot of what he was saying was that if you watch the video, look out for it. It's almost quite humorous in a way. To a certain extent, it was needed, but I did find it quite funny that there was a sort of okay, I hear what you're saying, but just do what I tell you. So what we then took from that was what are the implications for the essays that we have to write. So just to explain, I have an essay to write on formative assessment, which is going to look directly at Dylan Williams' work. I also have an annotated bibliography to write. Basically, it's a breakdown of 3 individual sources in one overall paper. So those are the 2 things that are relevant to this. I have other things I need to do as well. So anyone who has done any kind of persuasive writing will know that in order to best persuade someone, you need to not only understand the positives of what you're trying to talk about, but the negatives. So by having this kind of different viewpoint, it can be used to make any arguments that we're making about what William does and doesn't do a lot stronger, because we have that counterpoint there. So I suppose it's just like a general tip for anyone who is writing an essay that requires them to prove something, to have sources in, so on and so forth. It is no good just using sources that prove your argument, because it's so easy to pick to pieces, and it shows that you've not considered every standpoint before constructing your argument. If you are able to use a combination of sources that agree and disagree with whichever point that you are trying to make, then off the back of that, you can spend a little bit of time rebutting whatever the negative says with what the positive says, or vice versa, depending on what your standpoint is. So when constructing an argument, make sure you know the pluses, make sure you know the minuses, so that you can use them to mesh off of one another. The example I would use, if anyone out there watches epic rap battles of history, if you look at the basic structure of battle rapping, a lot of the best ones from the things that I have heard from people who are far more knowledgeable of it than me are the ones that include rebuttals as well as just poking fun and kind of trying to flaunt themselves. Because if you leave a point out there unrebutted, your opponent can use it again against you and can keep using it until you prove that it's not a problem. So apply that to any kind of argument, whether it's a written one, whether it's a verbal one, and apparently you won't go too far wrong. So moving on to the last day that we're going to be covering in this particular video, which I'm sure is already as long, if not twice as long as the previous one that I've put out. For the Wednesday, we spent actually not a lot of time in class, shall we say. We had a lot of space for independent study. At the moment, we're all working on putting together an Eportfolio. It is being given a different name, but it's an Eportfolio. So filling in all of the forms that are required for that, for me it's quite difficult, because a lot of the forms that are required to be in there are forms to do with placement. Placement's my favourite topic in the world. Well, it's still up in the air. There are still conversations going on in order to get me into a placement. Fingers crossed that will happen by January, because I really don't want to be leaving it any longer than that. But before I ramble on about it again, for the purposes of what I'm saying here, it just means that at least half of the paperwork that's due to be in this Eportfolio I can't do. So I have to instead focus on the things that I can do. Looking at things like my initial self-assessment. This was a form that we were given to get an idea, to gauge where we were. The idea being to bring this to our first tutorial, mine happens to be next Monday for anyone who's interested, and be able to say, right, this is where I was at the start of the course, this is where I feel I am now. And then to be able to talk that through with my tutor and basically say, right, where do I go from here? What do I need to do to improve? What targets do I need to set for myself? Which is great. When I did that particular form back in mid to late September time, I didn't have Microsoft Word downloaded onto my computer. I do now, but in order to get the formatting to work correctly in the program that I was using, I had to do a bit of fiddling about. I've since reopened that file and it was all over the place. Like it was almost incomprehensible. There was the table wasn't there anymore. All of the text had kind of wrapped into one and it was constantly repeating itself. So I just had to start from square one with it. And given that one of the tasks for me to do was to do my next self-assessment, it's made it so much more difficult and took up most of my time yesterday morning when I could have been doing, quite frankly, a lot more constructive things. But hey ho, technology is what it is. I suppose it's an important lesson to check these things more often, but it was so frustrating, so frustrating. But yeah, so that's what we spent most of the morning doing. Moving on into the late morning, early afternoon, we did go on to our video session. It's actually the last one of the year for the PSET PGCE. I have another one for my SEN specialism next week, but that will probably be covered in a different video. What we were looking at was the micro teachers that we had done and the grades that we had, what the pluses were, what the minuses were, and basically giving us an idea of where we stood next to what was expected of us, and how best to assess these things going forward. So as a class, none of us got below on track. So on track is about the level that you want to be at, because it means you're on track. It means you're exactly where you need to be. Now, it is possible to get like graded higher than that, and kind of be ahead of where you need to be. But as long as you're at that on track level, it's not a problem. No one in the group is falling behind, which includes me. So what we needed to look at off the back of that was, what were the strengths of the class coming out of this? What were the weaknesses of the class coming out of this? And strengths wise, we'd all made good use of digital resources, so things like Menti, Google Docs, Kahoot, all that kind of thing. I think because we were doing everything online, it did make it easier to innovate in that way. Now, I say innovate in the loosest term. I'm aware that these are all resources that are already being used in education by a lot of people. But in terms of what we were presenting, it made things a lot more interactive, and it also demonstrated that we were able to think outside of the box and go and do a bit of research to what people are actually using and go from there. Things like Menti, for instance, wasn't something that we were taught about. It was something that we found. When I say we found, my wife told me about it. But also being familiar with things like Google Docs and Kahoot and so on and so forth. These are all things that we brought from our own experience into what we were doing, which just made the microteachers a lot better. Subject knowledge wise, we were all pretty much spot on. I mean, that is the benefit of being able to pick what topic you're doing, is that you will pick something that you know a lot about, so that's fine. There's been a very supportive and very inclusive culture within the group so far. There's a tendency when you group people together, particularly when it's a group of people going through similar experiences, like say like a course or something along those lines, that cliques start to form. And this is going to be a bit of pseudo scientific babble. As a species, we're inclined to group together and form social circles to try and keep ourselves safe, and as a result it's a natural instinct for us to do that. Being in the environment that we're in, however, hasn't actually allowed for that to happen, in so much as no one is specifically sitting next to anyone else, no one is specifically spending more time with anyone else outside of class, all that kind of thing. It's a very interesting thing to consider going forward if, say for instance, you have students with social anxieties. For a lot of students with that, it would be very difficult for them to come on camera anyway. But if their anxiety is coming down to that kind of clickiness, that kind of pack mentality, maybe that's a way of assuaging that. Who knows? Something to consider going forward. But yeah, a very supportive environment that has been created by all of us. That just makes it so much easier and so much more relaxed in a time that could, quite frankly, be very, very stressful. I mean, it is still stressful, obviously, of course it is, but it's made a lot easier. Now, looking at where we need to improve, time management was a big thing for us. So for myself and my partner who I was working with, time management was kind of at the forefront of what we wanted to do. As a result, we didn't have too much assessment in our microteach, which, you know, it's all a learning experience. It's something we need to know to include going forward. But it does mean that we were exactly on time, as far as I know, because we timed it kind of to the second. For some of the other groups, because they had more assessment criteria in there, because there was more interactivity, and to a certain extent more use of different technologies, which they do tend to fail on you from time to time, that meant in a lot of cases they were running over. Now, that wasn't necessarily to their detriment, wasn't always necessarily their fault, but it is something to consider going forward. You know, do you allow time for if there are tech issues? Do you allow, like, how much time should you allow for group activities, so on and so forth? So it's all stuff that, that regardless of whether we included them or not in our own presentations, is great to be taken forward. So the final thing that we covered off was embedding maths and English skills. So that was an area that we were all struggling in. It's something that's apparently quite difficult at the stage we're at. Something that you really have to consider going into further education is that for a lot of students, not all, but quite a few, they will have had negative experiences with maths and English in the past. Particularly for SEND learners, this could be that their needs were not identified as early on as they should be. So they've perhaps been left behind, been labelled as someone who just isn't good at English or maths, or they may have even felt it appropriate to label themselves as someone who isn't good at English or maths. So when looking at how we apply this to other topics, we're then looking at, right, am I including things like crafts and data interpretation? Am I including things that involve writing, some form of reading or analysis? All of these are skills that develop as a result of your ability to understand English and maths. So those core skills have to be included as part of what you're doing overall. Interestingly though, the bit of advice that we were given is that it's important that your students don't necessarily know at the time that that's what you're doing. You're like embedding maths and you're embedding English. The reason being that if they've had that negative experience in the past where they think that they can't do it, as soon as you are all of a sudden presenting them with a maths problem, or you're presenting them with something that looks more like it's out of an English textbook than, say, for instance, a media one, they may shut off. They may feel that, oh, you know, I wanted to move on from this, I struggled with this, it's going to stop me from engaging. So how do you go about including all of that without letting them know? So your learning plan should include explicitly what it is that you're going to do to embed maths and English. But what you actually do should be implicit, so should be something that they don't even notice. And as you'll have seen throughout the rest of this video, I'm a fan of a very far-fetched and very thin example. But the thing that immediately came to mind for me was the game Among Us. So if you think of the teacher and, let's say for argument's sake, a potential observer as being the imposters in the game. For anyone not familiar with the game, you have up to 10 players who all have to complete a number of tasks, but throughout that number of tasks and throughout the players, there are 2 imposters who will try to kill each of the other players, stop them from doing the tasks, in between once a body's found, or if someone calls an emergency meeting, you can vote people off if you think that they're an imposter, and the game continues from there. So the reason that I kind of liken it to what we're doing here is that myself and the observer, knowing that I'm embedding maths, we're the imposters, whereas the rest of the class are the crewmates going along doing the tasks that they've been set, not realising that they're being bumped off one by one with equations. It's a very, very thin example, but it's one that I'm going to include anyway because I want to include Among Us in the thumbnail and get more views. I don't know if I'll leave that bit in. But yeah, so as ridiculous as that example is, I think a very important skill regarding teaching is being able to take an idea and run with it in a very different way, and it comes down to adaptability. So whilst Among Us might not have been the first thing that people would think of when it comes to an analogy for embedding maths in English, it's the first thing that came to my mind. And whilst it's something I may never use in the classroom, maybe it's something that'll help anyone out there watching these think of, right, okay, embedding maths in English, maybe not as tiresome. I am an imposter in Among Us. Yeah, I don't know if that'll really work, but hey, that's the first thing that came to mind for me. So on what has been admittedly an incredibly long video, we're going to round things up. If you would like to see more of these videos, there will be a playlist at the end that all the videos are in. Not all of them are this long, don't worry, it's only recently that I've started making them into close to hour-long epics. And if you would like to leave a comment below, any advice that you have for me, anything that you would like me to look into, that would be very much appreciated. Because I am still learning throughout this whole thing, and if it wasn't obvious from my from the examples that I've been giving. Yeah, if you could leave a like on the video as well, that would be much appreciated. Subscribe to the channel for more of these. Look after yourselves, and I will see you probably after Christmas. But if not, then, well, oh, what a terrible way to end the video. Have a great Christmas, have a good New Year, and let's hope 2021 goes better than 2020 did. See ya.